When my Korean daughter was just 13 years old, I offered to take her on a trip to South Korea to learn about her native culture and, if she wanted, to even try to find her birth parents. She didn't seriously consider that offer for even a minute, but she saw that I was vulnerable, and she said, "Could we go to London instead?" Never one to turn down any excuse to go to London, I signed on, and she was the perfect age for the trip. Just before her adolescent self became entirely embarrassed by absolutely everything I said and did, she was still under the impression that, as she once told her mother, my former wife, to my satisfaction, "Daddy does so know everything." We did some fun tourist things, but I also worked in a couple of visits to the British Museum where I could show her some of the most amazing artifacts from the history of the world, all stolen by British archaeologists and scientists in an earlier age when such theft was considered to be both research and preservation. As we started our trip back to the United States, back in those days when international flights offered just one movie screen at the front of the plane and we all got to watch whatever the airline had chosen, the first thing on the screen there in Tel Aviv was in London, was a brief newsreel about the Second Intifada that was going on in Palestine. So my daughter innocently asked, as we were taking off for our 7-hour flight back to the United States, "Daddy, why do the Palestinians and the Israelis hate each other so much?" How do two distinct ethnic and religious groups end up with such powerful claims of ownership on the exact same piece of real estate? So where do you begin to explain that? Frankly, I made several false starts. You can't really just start at the point of the Holocaust and the modern creation of the State of Israel in 1947. And in the end, I managed to keep going back until I was deep into the Hebrew Bible and the obviously fictitious accounts of Moses and the Egyptian Pharaoh, leading to the Zionist age of the Kingdom of David and the Babylonian captivity, and then the first dispersion of the Jews from Judah by Rome in their first century attempt to make Jews extinct. I don't know how much of it she was awake for, but I do clearly remember that we were making our descent into Chicago while I was still talking. And it took Valerie the better part of 20 years to screw up the courage to ever ask me another question. But how would you answer a question like that? Why has there never been a workable solution that would allow Jews and Palestinians to live on the same tiny postage stamp of global real estate in peace? And how could they both have such viscerally defensible, legitimate claims to the same place? Now, one of the ironies of the Jewish claim to Palestine is that they draw it from the Bible, from the Exodus event. But if you remember your Sunday school lessons well, regarding that little piece of Jewish history, the Jews were not originally from that area. And so when they moved there, they found it inhabited and had to fight generations of wars with other tribes to gain control of it. Of course, the Bible was written by Jews. It was written for Jews, and claims that God gave it to the Jews shouldn't be a big surprise, but it's not a title that would stand up in a court of law. A book written by the Jews would say that they hold a divine title to the land where they live. But the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Philistines, they were never a big fan of the Hebrew Bible. Even if you take the biblical accounts as being loosely based on history, it was still a story of occupation, of conquest, of wars. So the question before us in the modern world is, rather unchanged. When do national boundaries become sacred? When are they legal? When is it wrong to violate them? When is it the status quo? And when was migration, conquest, annexation considered to be legitimate? How long does California, just as one example, have to be a part of the United States before the claim that it was a part of Mexico no longer has any merit? Or for that matter, when would the claims of Mexico trump the claims of various Native American tribes who lived there before there was a Mexico? Why is the American claim on Arizona more legitimate than Russia's claim on Ukraine? Or the claim of Palestinians on the land we now call Israel? Why is that more legitimate than the claim of the current Jewish inhabitants? You know, frankly, this is the real problem that I have with all of the popularity of these DNA tests that people take. And they will sit with you and confidently tell you that they're 20% Irish and 30% German, and then a laundry list of other ingredients like they were a can of dog food. Folks, let me save you some money. We are all from Africa. The human race evolved in Africa, and over thousands of years, people migrated out of Africa all over the globe. So your ancestors may have spent some time in Germany, they may have spent some time in Ireland or even Asia before they ended up where you live now. But unless you are living in Africa, it is very likely that your ancestors have lived in a lot of different places over the centuries. We have various terms to describe the movement of people around the globe. In prehistoric times, we talked about human migration from one continent to another, but we know from the dawn of time that there have been migrations that involved conquest and occupation. Most of the shape of the modern world's map was based on a couple of centuries of colonization. Sadly, a few of those centuries of colonization involved genocide of indigenous peoples, and then the labor force of indigenous peoples was replaced by capturing slaves on other continents, primarily Africa. As the anti-slavery movement grew in the early United States, there was an organization called the American Colonization Society that actually acquired land in West Africa that they named Liberia, and that was to be the homeland of freed American slaves, even if those slaves had been born in America and their parents had been born in America and their parents had been born in America, because slavery went on this continent for 300 years. So more than half of the 40,000 black freed slaves that were sent to Liberia died in the first months that they were there. They were black, but it had been a long time since they had been African. Telling people to just go back where they came from is now typically seen as a racial insult. But there lingers some romantic sense that everyone could, if they would just do it, get up and go back where they were from. You may recall the controversy created by the nearly 90-year-old White House correspondent, Helen Thomas, who was asked for a comment about how to solve the conflict in Israel and Palestine in 2012, and she just, off the top of her head, said, the Jews should get the hell out of Palestine. And she was forced to apologize, and then she was forced to resign her chair in the press corps because her comment was seen to be anti-Semitic. Now, it was inartful, you can't deny that, but I've said for many years that we never should have joined Great Britain in the decision to take part of the British protectorate in Palestine in the 1940s to create a Jewish homeland. The Jews who had survived the Holocaust certainly deserved and certainly needed a homeland, but the Holocaust had not been conducted by Palestinians. It was a horrible historic crime committed by European Christians against European Jews. The sacrifice of land to create a homeland certainly should have come out of the offender's territory. It should have come out of Germany, and I would argue even Poland, because in spite of the fact that the Polish government says it just ain't so, eyewitness accounts let us know that there were more Jews killed in Poland than killed in Germany. But we created a Jewish homeland, forcing Palestinians to make the sacrifice that should have been made by Europeans. Both Jews and Christians may have been overly affected by biblical narratives about what we have always called the Holy Land. So at the end of World War II, the solution to the tragedy of the Holocaust, it appealed to people who had gone to Sunday school as children to put it in Israel, in the Middle East, in Palestine. The voices of the Palestinians who were being displaced were not heeded. This land theft by the victors of World War II created hostilities that immediately issued in violent attempts at what they called driving the Jews into the sea, to literally push them into the Mediterranean and end this newly created state of Israel. Now, whatever emotions may have motivated the British and Americans to support the creation of Israel on Palestinian land, whatever it was in 1947, it became evident as the war ended and the automobile industry was exploding that our interest in the oil fields in the Middle East were such that we have defended Israel's existence at every turn because of our own economic interest. You could say that Israel has been in a perpetual state of war with her neighbors ever since the modern state was founded. I think Israel has technically named 19 wars in this 76-year history. But the reason we've heard so much in the last couple of weeks about people hiding in their safe rooms is that most people have a safe room because missile launches, bombs, and attacks have been common all along. I have met people while visiting in Israel who literally grew up sleeping every single night of their childhood in a bomb shelter. A possible attack is always in the back of people's minds. The radical sentiment of pushing the Jews into the sea was very pervasive in the early years, but over time, as almost no one alive today can remember a time when Israel did not exist where it is, there are Palestinians who want to live in peace with Israel. But there's a minority that only pretends to talk about peace while always plotting to kill as many Jews as they can. And these are not rigid emotional borders. People change in the course of their own lifetimes and sometimes can change on a dime based on what's happened in the news. There are many Israelis who want peace with Palestine, but there are others who feel that it is a hopeless situation, and their only chance of survival is to virtually wipe out the Palestinian population. There's even a phrase in the Israeli military called mowing the grass, when they go out to kill a number of Palestinians. So every skirmish, every police killing, every terrorist murder, and especially taking hostages, raping young girls, killing babies, violence against people who were literally running for shelter in a bomb shelter, shooting them as they ran for safety, this radicalizes people more and more. When Israel was founded, they were initially attacked by all of their neighbors, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, the Transjordan. But now Israel is fighting against terrorist organizations, not nations. Hezbollah and Hamas fighters don't wear uniforms. It's not even fair to call them militias. They are terrorists. There's not a government of Hamas, so there's not a capital of Hezbollah. And who is to say how many people in the Gaza Strip would be considered to be members of Hamas or even Hamas sympathizers or supporters? But still, Hamas bases their missile launching systems right in the middle of apartment complexes where civilians live, where it would not be safe to object. And given the dynamic of the hardships of life in the Gaza Strip, the same person might choose to fight with Hamas one day and next week fight against Hamas. Israel is now threatening a war on an idea, not a country, not an army, but on a sentiment of those who just don't want the Jews to live where they are. But folks, the real offense of Helen Thomas's comment a few years ago is the simple fact that the Israelis don't have anywhere to go back to. There are many ethnic minorities who also don't have a homeland anymore, but it was the unique circumstances of the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust that made Western powers believe that this particular ethnic group should be given a homeland. And I don't disagree with that. I just think it should have been in Europe. But the recent attack by Hamas terrorists has forced me to focus on the present. Continuing to debate the establishment of the modern state of Israel is really material for a history class. It does not and it cannot address the fact that there is now a Jewish homeland in the Middle East surrounded by majority Muslim states that do not want to accept that what happened in 1947 cannot be undone in 2023. I adamantly remain convinced that it was a bad idea, but it wasn't the only bad idea made in the post-colonial world. And now it presents us with a nearly unsolvable problem that demands of us not just an idea of a solution, but an enacted solution that happens immediately. About 500 of my closest friends received an essay from me a few days after October 7, and I was still struggling with a long-term and innate desire to blame Benjamin Netanyahu and his administration's absurdly abusive policies towards the Gaza Strip for the violence. But even then, I knew you couldn't blame Benjamin Netanyahu for the kind of terrorist techniques that Hamas used. We liberals are ipso facto going to be on the side of the underdogs. But I want to ask my people, we liberals, to slow down and think about the hard realities and not fall into false equivalencies at this important juncture. Two things can be true at once. I still believe that Benjamin Netanyahu has been disingenuous, he's been dishonest, he's been indicted for 3 serious crimes, of which I'm prepared to believe he's guilty. But no matter what happens now in Israel and the Gaza Strip, Netanyahu's political career really should be over. If you remember last month, Joe Biden wouldn't even meet him in the White House. He had to schedule a meeting with him at another location because Biden has been aware of what a bad prime minister that Benjamin Netanyahu has been. But since the attacks on October 7, we've had to kind of turn around and be completely supportive of Netanyahu's government, but always with the awareness that this can't be allowed to go on. We have to find a way to end his political influence and change the circumstances that exist in the Gaza Strip. I don't often throw roses at American presidents. As you know, I've been an equal opportunity critic of both Democrats and Republicans all of my career. But credit where credit is due. I honestly cannot fault Joe Biden and how he has handled this impossible situation with Israel trying to have a military response to an ideological problem. Netanyahu's instincts, and I fear many Israelis who now have family members being tortured as prisoners of Hamas, and those who've had family members from teenagers attending a music festival to children that were just in daycare or in school who are now dead, understandably, those people would like to see the Israeli army wipe the Gaza Strip right off the map. We came too close to doing the same thing when we attacked Afghanistan after 9/11. We also had suffered a horrible terrorist attack, but had no army to retaliate against, no government of al-Qaeda. We killed thousands of civilians who simply had the crime of having been living in proximity to the training camps that got those al-Qaeda militants ready to fight, whether they had any sympathies with al-Qaeda or not. President Biden has reasonably assured Netanyahu, in spite of his misgivings about his policies, that the United States will support the Israeli people in the midst of this war, and they should never doubt our support. But at the same time, he has both publicly and privately insisted on restraint and to take care to avoid civilian casualties. He has coupled, more by implication, I think, than by contract, that our military aid is tied to the humanitarian aid given to civilians of the Gaza Strip. Yeah, our president often looks like a confused senior citizen who can't keep their bingo card straight at the senior center. But when it really matters, he seems to have admirable clarity of vision. In fact, who among us really could have done better than what he has done? I truly could not say that he should have done something different than what he has done in these past 2 weeks. We cannot allow Hamas to rack up political wins as a result of killing children and raping young girls, taking hostages, killing civilians, running for safety. They cannot be rewarded for these subhuman tactics. However, we have to accept that we have talked about this two-state solution without making any real progress for way too long. We cannot continue to justify Israel's oppression of Palestine. Israel's existence where it is cannot rationally be debated. I'm still mad about it, but I'm going to try to stop talking about it because it cannot be reasonably undone. Israel's right to defend itself against terrorist attacks can't really be questioned. And the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip need to be given greater freedom and greater opportunity, but not greater freedom to keep fighting with Israel and not the opportunity to keep spending their resources on rockets and bombs rather than a decent future for their young people. Now, we fought the Germans and the Japanese in World War II. I was born 10 years later, and they were our allies, trading partners. You know, historically, we've invaded Canada. We annexed the northern half of Mexico. And now we love to vacation in Mexico, and we import almost all of our comedians and hockey players from Canada. We began in a war with Great Britain, and yet Americans now, mysteriously to me, follow news of the royal family as if we were still subjects of the crown. Heck, we've invaded Nicaragua 4 times in the last 100 years, and most of you don't even know we've been there once. And when I've been there doing relief work over the years, I've never detected a moment of hostility towards me because I'm an American. Warring factions can learn to see that their best interests are served when they live in peace with their former enemies and cooperate in building a better future for everyone. The purpose of terrorism is to instill terror in the people they hate. The only way to defeat terrorism is to refuse to be afraid. It is our fear that makes us want to fight a war of retaliation. I admit that there will be a military response to the terrorist attacks of Hamas. But I beg you to see beyond next month. The only real answers lie in the direction of diplomacy. The Jews will not be driven into the sea, and the Palestinians will not be annihilated. The most difficult and the most necessary of all renunciations is resentment. The desire for revenge is powerful, but as the old Chinese proverb says, the fire you kindle against your enemies burns you. The best hope for peace in Israel is to create justice in Palestine.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.